Hey guys, tonight we slip into the sands of time, and you already know what's waiting for you out there in the desert. Those gigantic pyramids, rising like stone mountains under the stars. And if you've ever imagined them being built in a quick, miraculous burst, well, you're not alone. A lot of people picture ancient Egyptians snapping their fingers, chanting a spell, and boom, the pyramids stood tall overnight, like some ancient instant noodles version of architecture. You probably won't survive this fantasy, because the reality is far heavier, sweatier, and surprisingly human. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the desert. The air is so dry that your lips crack just by breathing. Sand crunches beneath your sandals as you tilt your head back. There it is, the Great Pyramid, towering above you like it wants to scrape the stars. People say it went up in a flash, but if you listen close, you'll hear something else: the groan of wooden sledges, the clink of chisels, the murmur of thousands of voices as men haul block after block for decades. Here's the myth: the pyramids were built almost magically fast. One day, barren desert; the next, perfect pyramid. It's the kind of image cartoons and movies love. If you believed this, don't worry, in good company. Even Napoleon once stared at the pyramids and muttered, "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down on you," as if they'd popped up fully formed just to mock the rest of history. But the truth: the Great Pyramid alone took roughly 20 years of back-breaking effort. 20 years of planning, cutting, dragging, and setting stones heavier than your car. And that's just one pyramid. Multiply that by the dozens scattered along the Nile, and you start to realize Egypt wasn't running a fast food drive-thru. It was running a marathon. Imagine you're one of those builders. Your hands are blistered from the rope. Your back aches from pushing limestone blocks up ramps that stretch like endless snakes of sand. Every sunrise means another day of sweat under a sky that has no mercy. And every night you collapse by the Nile with bread, beer, and the aching pride of a job that won't be finished in your lifetime. Archaeologists estimate the Great Pyramid required around 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing 2.5 to 15 tons. No overnight magic, just engineering, manpower, and time. Ancient graffiti has been found inside the pyramids, left by workers. Crews with names like the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu, basically history's earliest worksite. Jokes proof. These weren't slaves whipped into silence, but teams with pride and humor. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used straight ramps, zigzagging switchbacks, or spiral ramps wrapped around the pyramid's sides. The mystery of how exactly keeps scholars scribbling notes to this day. So no, the pyramids didn't just appear like your Wi-Fi router rebooting. They were the world's most intense construction project, powered not by magic, but by human sweat and clever math. Next time someone says they built them overnight, just smile and say, "Sharif, your definition of overnight is 2 decades, thousands of workers, and a backache the size of the Sahara." And don't worry, this is just the first myth. The desert's still full of stories that refuse to stay buried. you walk deeper into the desert night, the pyramid shrinking behind you as the Nile's breeze drifts across the sand. In your mind, the pharaoh stands tall, glowing like a sun god, lightning in one hand, justice in the other. That's the myth, isn't it? That the pharaoh wasn't just king, but an actual god, descending straight from the heavens to command the Nile. Cartoons, movies, even textbooks love to oversimplify. Pharaoh equals God, unquestionable and immortal. It's like saying the boss at your office is also Zeus, untouchable, unquestionable, and somehow glowing in gold. You'd probably quit by lunch. Here's the image. Pharaoh wakes up, stretches, and people fall to their knees. His words are divine law, his gaze melts stone, and if he sneezes, the gods send rain. Sounds dramatic, right? That's the myth, that Pharaoh was not just king, but God incarnate on earth. Reality, a little more complicated. Pharaohs were humans, fragile and flawed, but they wrapped themselves in divine branding. Think of it as ancient carefully staged rituals, monuments, and myths designed to convince millions that one man was more than mortal. When the harvest failed or enemies invaded, guess who was blamed? Yup, the living God. That title was as much a burden as a crown. Imagine you're a pharaoh, stepping into the great temple at Karnak. Priests burn incense that stings your eyes. The crowd chants your name as if you're Ra, the sun god himself. Inside, your stomach is twisting, because you know last night's flood reports weren't good. If the Nile doesn't rise high enough, no grain, no bread, and suddenly no throne. Being a god in public meant being terrified in private. Pharaohs were considered the sons of Ra, or Horus incarnate, but inscriptions also emphasize their role as mediators, humans, acting as bridges between gods and people. Some pharaohs bent the rules. Akhenaten tried to convince everyone there was only one god, Aten, and insisted he alone could talk to him. Imagine a king saying, "Forget everyone else, only my hotline works." Historians still argue whether Egyptians truly believed pharaohs were gods, or whether it was political theater, way to unify a diverse land under one symbolic figure. So no, the pharaoh wasn't born shooting lightning bolts from his hands. He was a man in fancy sandals, propped up by ceremony, myth, and politics, the god-king image. Think of it as the world's earliest brand, logo, half faith, half advertising campaign. Next time you picture a pharaoh as a golden superhero, remember, even he had to worry about taxes, floods, and whether his eyeliner smudged in the heat. The desert whispers on, and another myth stirs this time, about the hands that raised those stone giants in the first place. You're standing in the desert again, staring up at the limestone blocks, glowing under the moonlight. Somewhere in your school books, or maybe in every Hollywood epic you've ever seen, you were told the pyramids rose on the broken backs of slaves. Thousands whipped into submission, collapsing in chains, all for the glory of one king's ego. It's an image so dramatic, it practically writes itself. Whip cracks, sweat pours, chains rattle, cue sad music. But the truth, it's not just less cruel, it's way more interesting. Here's the popular picture. Pharaoh sits on his golden throne while endless rows of slaves drag blocks through the desert, each one groaning under the lash. It's the Bible movie version, Exodus-style drama with a soundtrack of suffering. For decades, school teachers and Hollywood producers sold this idea like popcorn. Now imagine instead you're a craftsman, not a chained captive. Your hands are calloused, but proud as you carve limestone with precision. You get paid in bread and beer, the staples of Egyptian life, fanned when the day ends. You walk home to a village built for pyramid workers. There, your wife tends the fire. Your kids chase each other with reed toys. And the gossip isn't about freedom, but about which crew carved straighter lines. Archaeologists uncovered entire workers' villages near the pyramid stone houses. Bakeries, even breweries. The builders weren't slaves, whipped in misery. They were skilled laborers, respected for their craft, fed and housed by the state. Excavations at Giza revealed that pyramid workers lived in organized villages, were rotated in shifts, and received rations of bread, beer, and meat. Workers left graffiti inside the pyramids, with names like the Friends of Khufu and * the Drunkards of Menkaure. Yes, Egypt's greatest monuments were brought to you by teams with names that sound like office softball leagues. Historians still argue how much of the labor was corvée, a form of national duty, versus fully professional crews. Were they patriotic volunteers, conscripts, or career builders? The line blurs. You crouch inside the half-built corridor of the Great Pyramid, torchlight flickering against fresh limestone. Around you, men laugh, eat figs, and scratch crude doodles of boats on the wall. Someone slaps your back and says, "Tomorrow we finish this block." No chains, no whips, just pride. So no, the pyramids weren't raised by slaves groaning under lashes. They were built by free workers whose sweat carried honor, not shackles. Next time someone tells you slaves built the pyramids, smile and say, "Actually, it was more like the world's first union job with beer breaks." The desert quiets for a moment, but not for long. Another myth waits in the shadows, glittering with gold and promises of life after death. The desert air cools as you wander toward a half-buried tomb. You picture it, glittering, stuffed wall to wall with golden thrones, jeweled masks, and piles of treasure meant for some spoiled king's eternal nap. That's the classic image, right? Ancient Egyptians obsessed with gold, hoarding it like dragons, and packing it all away in their tombs just to impress the gods. It's the myth we all know. The afterlife was a golden palace, a cosmic bling. The way most people imagine it. Every pharaoh died and instantly rolled into the afterlife on a golden yacht, with mountains of treasure stacked neatly behind him. The belief sounds like a mix between a Vegas casino and a billionaire's mansion. If you didn't die rich, tough luck, you'd spend eternity broke. But reality was far more layered. Yes, gold mattered, symbols of the sun's eternal light, but afterlife prep wasn't about showing off wealth. It was about ensuring continuity of existence. Egyptians wanted the body preserved, the name remembered, and the soul equipped with daily tools for living. Bread, beer, combs, even board games have been found tucked into tombs. Imagine you're lying in a chamber carved from limestone. The air smells of resin from your embalming. Beside you rests not just gold, but a basket of onions. Yes, onions, because Egyptians believed they symbolized eternity. Your walls are painted not with dollar signs, but with images of rivers, farms, and feasts, so your spirit never starves. The Book of the Dead wasn't about treasure maps. It was a collection of spells and instructions guiding souls safely through the underworld. Some tombs contained shabby figurines, little servant dolls meant to come alive in the afterlife and do chores for the deceased. Basically, the earliest remote workers. Egyptologists still debate whether the afterlife focus was primarily religious symbolism or a practical insurance plan against cosmic uncertainty. Were tomb goods for gods or for comfort? You're a tomb painter in Thebes, crouching, with brush in hand, carefully painting a farmer harvesting wheat. You know no one alive will see this scene again, but the dead will, and that's what matters. So no, Egyptians weren't hoarding treasure just to flaunt it. They were packing suitcases for eternities, sometimes with gold, sometimes with onions, and sometimes with dolls that promised to mow the cosmic lawn. Next time you hear obsessed with gold, remember, they weren't bling addicts, they were careful travelers prepping for the longest journey of all. And as the torchlight flickers on painted walls, another figure emerges from the shadows, one of Egypt's most famous rulers, remembered less for her power than for a rumor about her beauty. The Nile wind cools your face as you step into the grand halls of Alexandria, the marble floors gleaming in torchlight, statues of God's tower above you. But the whispers aren't about them, they're about her, Cleopatrican seductress, the so-called woman whose beauty toppled empires. That's the myth passed down, a temptress so dazzling that mighty Romans lost their heads, hearts, and armies at her feet. It's the image Shakespeare sold, the Hollywood version, the stereotype Cleopatra, as the femme fatale who won with eyeliner instead of intellect. But you and I both know history rarely runs on lipstick. Here's how the story usually goes. Julius Caesar sails into Egypt, takes one look at Cleopatra, and bam, history changes because she's the most beautiful woman alive. Later, Mark Antony falls just as hard, and suddenly Rome's politics crumble under her charm. To hear the myth, you'd think Cleopatra walked into a Senate meeting, fluttered her eyelashes, and entire empires bent the knee. It's dramatic, it's cinematic, but it's not the truth. Reality check. Cleopatra wasn't extraordinary because of her face. She was extraordinary because of her mind. Ancient writers note she spoke at least 9 languages. She personally negotiated treaties, commanded fleets, and steered Egypt through famine and war. When she rolled herself dramatically into Caesar's palace inside a carpet that wasn't flirting, it was political theater, a stunt designed to shock and shift the game. Imagine you're Cleopatra stepping into that hall, the Roman general's eyes narrowing as servants unroll the rug. You don't blink, you lock eyes, not with the softness of a lover, but with the sharpness of a strategist. You need Rome's support to secure your throne, and you know drama gets attention faster than begging. This isn't beauty, this is branding. Ancient coins depicting Cleopatra show her with a hooked nose and strong jaw, not the movie star looks later imagined. Historians agree her charisma and intellect mattered more than physical beauty. Cleopatra ran an entire research lab in Alexandria, funding experiments in medicine and chemistry. Some legends even claim she wrote medical texts under a pseudonym. Move over, beauty tips. She was publishing ancient science. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra's downfall came from Roman propaganda, painting her as a manipulative temptress. or whether her boldness simply threatened Roman masculinity. Either way, beauty was never the real weapon, it was narrative spin. You sit in Cleopatra's private study. Papyrus scrolls cover the desk. She leans over a map of the Mediterranean, tracing Roman trade routes with an ink-stained finger. Outside, servants whisper about her charm. Inside, you see her eyes, calculating, relentless. She's not planning her makeup. She's planning Rome's next move. So no, Cleopatra didn't rewrite history because of eyeliner. She rewrote it with intelligence sharper than any blade and strategies bolder than any general's. When people call her beautiful, they miss the point. Her real power wasn't in her reflection, but in her vision. Next time someone sighs about Cleopatra's beauty, smile and say, "Sure, but she also spoke 9 languages, commanded fleets, and outnegotiated Julius Caesar." Try doing that with just eyeliner. The torches flicker out, and in the silence of the tombs, another myth stirs, this one, about curses whispered in the dark. Curses said to follow anyone who dares disturb a pharaoh's rest. The torchlight wavers as you step into the dark, narrow tunnel of a newly opened tomb. You've seen the movies. An archaeologist dares to break the seal. Hieroglyphs glow with warning, and then the curse hits: storms, sickness, and sudden death. The myth of Egypt's curses is irresistible, perfect for late-night ghost stories and tabloid headlines. But the truth, the pharaoh's curse wasn't magic. It was microbes, politics, and media hype. Here's the legend. Ancient Egyptians carved warnings on their tombs, vowing eternal vengeance on anyone who dared disturb their rest. And when modern explorers cracked those tombs open, disasters followed. The most famous, Lord Carnarvon, who financed the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, died mysteriously soon after. Newspapers screamed curse, and the world ate it up. The image is so strong that even today, people hesitate to say Tut's name without whispering. It's the ultimate spooky bedtime story. Egyptian mummies, ancient curses, and archaeologists dropping dead like flies. Reality was less supernatural, more dusty. Tombs, sealed for thousands of years, were breeding grounds for bacteria, mold, and poisonous gases. Step inside, inhale a lungful, and boom, you weren't cursed, you were infected. Now imagine you're one of those 1920s diggers. The desert sun bakes your back. You duck into the tomb, torch in one hand, scarf wrapped around your face. The air inside is heavy, strange, almost wet with the breath of centuries. You cough, eyes watering, not from magic but from spores stirred into the air. Hours later, your stomach twists, fever burns your body, and the headlines write themselves. Curse claims another victim. The famous curse inscription is mostly a Hollywood invention. When Carnarvon died from blood poisoning caused by a mosquito bite, London's newspapers claimed the lights in Cairo went out at the same time. Coincidence? Probably. Spooky? Absolutely. Tut's discovery were statistically unusual or simply exaggerated by media frenzy. Was it real danger or just a lucky streak for tabloid sales? A colleague whispers, "What if the curse is real?" You roll your eyes, but then you cough again, harder this time. The dust burns your throat. In the silence, the thought creeps in. Maybe curses aren't written in stone. So no, the pharaohs weren't firing magic bolts from beyond the grave. Their curses were the invisible armies of bacteria, wrapped up in millennia of dust and a sprinkle of media drama. Next time someone whispers about the curse of the mummy, remind them, sometimes the dead don't need spells. They just need a good publicist, a few spores of mold. The desert exhales again, and with the dust settled, another myth drifts closer, not about curses this time, but about Egypt itself. The idea that it stayed the same forever, untouched by time. The desert looks eternal. The pyramids stand silent, the temples loom unchanged, and the Nile still snakes through the land as if it's been frozen in time. That's the picture most people carry. Ancient Egypt as a static, unchanging civilization. A place where every farmer, every pharaoh, every priest lived exactly the same way for 3,000 years. It's the myth of timeless Egypt, a culture carved in stone, immune to change. Here's the story you've been told. From the very first pyramid to Cleopatra's dramatic end, Egypt stayed the same. Same gods, same temples, same farmers, pushing the same plows. As if history pressed pause the moment the Nile flooded and never hit play again. Sounds neat, sounds poetic, but it's wrong, the truth. Egypt changed constantly politically, culturally, and religiously. Over 3,000 years, it reinvented itself more times than your phone updates in a year. Dynasties rose and fell, foreigners invaded and ruled. Gods were swapped or merged, and art styles shifted dramatically. Egypt wasn't frozen, it was fluid. Imagine you're a scribe in 2500 BCE, drawing hieroglyphs of gods with falcon heads. Centuries later, your descendant in 1500 BCE paints new gods, new rituals, new languages on temple walls. By 300 BCE, Cleopatra's court is speaking Greek alongside Egyptian, and Roman merchants stroll through Alexandria's markets. Eternal? Hardly. Egypt's history spans over 3,000 years, across more than 30 dynasties, with dramatic changes in religion, architecture, and politics. During the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt shifted to worshipping just one god, Aten, the sun disk. It was history's first experiment with monotheism. Then it was abandoned after his death. Egyptologists still argue whether these shifts were revolutions by rulers or gradual cultural evolutions shaped by ordinary people. You're a farmer in the Old Kingdom, offering bread to the god Ra. A few centuries later, your grandson bows to Ammon. By Cleopatra's time, your descendants pour wine to honor Dionysus at a festival in Alexandria. Your family line proves Egypt wasn't eternal, it was adaptable. So no, Egypt wasn't frozen in amber like some ancient snow globe. It was a civilization that shifted, adapted, and evolved, constantly reshaping itself across millennia. Next time someone says eternal, Egypt, just grin and reply, eternal. More like history's longest remix album. And as the river carries echoes of change, another myth surfaces, this one about the strange animals Egyptians supposedly worshipped as gods. The desert night quiets, and in the distance you hear the soft cry of a cat. Instantly, your imagination fills with a common story. Ancient Egyptians bowing to cats, worshipping crocodiles, even mummifying ibises and baboons, as if every animal was a god. The myth says they were obsessed, an entire civilization run by a petting zoo. But the truth, they saw them as symbols, living metaphors of divine powers, woven into religion and daily life. Here's the picture. Egyptians spent their days feeding cats golden tuna. If Hollywood had its way, you'd think the temples were more like zoos, with priests chasing after sacred monkeys. It's the kind of story that sticks because it feels quirky, exotic, and strange. In reality, animals were chosen as sacred, not because Egyptians thought they were gods, but because they represented qualities linked to gods. Cats weren't deities themselves, they symbolized Bastet, the goddess of protection and the home. Crocodiles weren't worshipped because people loved them, but because they embodied Sobek, the fierce power of the Nile. Imagine you're standing in a temple in the city of Crocodilopolis. Yes, that was a real place. A crocodile lies on a platform, jaws tied shut, adorned with jewels. People file past, not because they think this individual crocodile controls the universe, but because it represents the raw, unpredictable force of nature they depend on and fear. Archaeologists have found massive animal cemeteries, like millions of mummified ibises dedicated to Thoth, the god of wisdom. These weren't random pets. They were ritual offerings. Some sacred cats were mummified with such care that tiny golden masks were placed over their faces. Ancient history's version of luxury pet aftercare. Historians still argue whether animal cults were primarily spiritual devotion or part of Egypt's economy, since breeding and selling sacred animals became a major industry. You crouch in the courtyard of a temple, clutching a small kitten. As the animal blinks, you don't see a cat, you see protection, warmth, and the goddess watching over your home. So no, Egyptians weren't worshipping Fluffy and Fido. They were reading the universe through animals, seeing divine qualities in their strength, grace, and mystery. Next time someone jokes that Egyptians worshipped cats, tell them, not quite. They just understood sooner than we did that cats already act like gods. And as the sacred animals curl back into the shadows, another myth slithers forward. The idea that Egypt stood alone, untouched by the outside world, pyramids, temples, tombs. It feels like a self-contained civilization, untouched by neighbors, sealed in its own eternal bubble. That's the myth. Ancient Egypt as an isolated kingdom, doing its own thing while the rest of the world passed by. But the truth, Egypt was never an island. It was a crossroads of trade, war, ideas, and culture. Here's the common picture. Egyptians never looked beyond their deserts. They grew their grain, prayed to their gods, buried their kings, and ignored the rest of the planet. They were so wrapped up in the Nile that they didn't bother with Greece, Mesopotamia, Nubia, or anyone else. The myth paints Egypt as timeless and cut off. In reality, Egypt's survival depended on connection. The Nile gave them fertile land, but gold came from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and wine from the Mediterranean. Pharaohs weren't just farmers and they were deal-makers, warriors, and global networkers. Imagine you're a merchant in Thebes. Your barge is stacked with grain, drifting north to trade with Phoenicians for cedar wood. On the shore, a Nubian envoy unloads gold ingots, while Greek sailors haggle over olive oil. The marketplace hums with languages, accents, and smells, a living reminder that Egypt wasn't sealed away but plugged into the ancient world. Archaeologists found Mycenaean pottery in Egyptian tombs and Egyptian scarabs in Greece, evidence of trade stretching across the Mediterranean. Ramses II even signed one of history's first known peace treaties with the Hittites after years of war, complete with friendly dinners and family marriages. Ancient diplomacy at its finest. Historians still argue whether Egypt was a dominant superpower controlling trade, or more of a participant relying on neighbors for survival. You stand in a crowded port at Memphis. Ships creak against the dock. A Nubian trader shows you a necklace of pure gold. A Phoenician hands you cedar resin that smells sharp and sweet. You feel the tug of worlds beyond Egypt, carried in on every breeze. So no, Egypt wasn't a hermit kingdom playing alone in the sandbox. It was an ancient hub, thriving on connections that stretched across continents. Next time someone says, Egypt was isolated, smile and reply, sure, by isolated you mean hosting the ancient version of international trade fairs. And as the ships vanish into the horizon, another myth looms closer, this time about Egypt's monuments themselves. The idea that they were indestructible, eternal, immune to time. The moonlight washes over the Great Pyramid, and it looks eternal-like. A mountain that defies time. That's the myth. Egypt's monuments were indestructible, immune to decay, standing exactly as they were thousands of years ago. People imagine pyramids and temples as permanent fixtures, outlasting everything and everyone, but the truth. Egypt's monuments were not invincible. They crumbled, cracked, eroded, and were often torn apart by humans themselves. Here's the classic belief. Pharaohs built monuments so strong that even earthquakes, armies, and time couldn't touch them. Once a pyramid rose, it would stand forever, a stone skyscraper immune to history. Even today, tourists step into Egypt and marvel. It's all still here. That's the illusion. In reality, most monuments are gone. Temples collapsed under floods, pyramids lost their smooth casing stones, and statues were smashed by conquerors. Locals often recycled blocks to build their own houses. Imagine spending decades building a temple, only for your great-grandchildren to cart off the stone to patch up a wall. Picture yourself walking into Karnak Temple. Once, columns soared, like stone forests, painted in brilliant reds and blues. Now, many lie broken on the sand, their colors faded by sun and wind. These weren't untouchable giants. They were fragile in the face of time and human greed. The Great Pyramid was once covered in gleaming white limestone casing stones that reflected sunlight. Most were stripped in the Middle Ages to build Cairo's mosques. In the 14th century, an earthquake loosened more casing stones from the pyramids, which were quickly recycled into city walls. Even pharaohs couldn't fight medieval contractors. Historians still argue whether some monuments collapsed naturally due to poor construction or were deliberately destroyed as acts of conquest and power. You're a villager in medieval Cairo. At dawn, you walk to the pyramid, pry loose a smooth stone, and haul it back home to build a fireplace. To you, it's not a miracle of eternity. It's free building material. So no, Egypt's monuments weren't immortal giants standing untouched for eternity. They were survivors, some intact, many scarred, others stolen. Next time someone says pyramids are indestructible, tell them, true, unless you're an earthquake, a conqueror, or a guy who needs kitchen tiles, and his broken columns lie silent in the sand. Another myth rises from the shadows, this one about the bodies inside those tombs, and the idea that mummies were always perfectly preserved. The torchlight flickers across a sarcophagus, and in your imagination, you see a perfect mummy, linen wrapped with machine-like precision, skin intact, face serene, body waiting forever in flawless preservation. That's the myth, every mummy. A masterpiece of embalming, untouched by time. But the truth, mummies were not always perfect. Some were rushed, some botched, and some weren't even real. Most people think mummification was always this miraculous science that kept pharaohs looking like wax statues forever. Hollywood loves to show smooth bandages, pristine faces, and the idea that every ancient Egyptian ended up perfectly preserved. The myth makes mummification look like a one-size-fits-all miracle. In reality, the process changed constantly. Some mummies were expertly crafted with resin oils and weeks of drying. Others were poorly done skin, burned by cheap resins, bought it, stuffed with sawdust, or wrapped so sloppily you'd swear the undertaker was late for lunch. In some cases, embalmers even faked it, wrapping empty bundles of linen and charging grieving families full price. Imagine you're a wealthy Egyptian's son. You bring your father's body to the embalmers, paying a hefty fee. Weeks later, you receive what looks like a pristine mummy. Centuries later, archaeologists unwrap it, and inside, nothing but rags and sticks. Fraud isn't a modern invention. It thrived even in ancient funerals. Studies of mummies show great variations. Some bodies are excellently preserved, while others are decayed, incomplete, or even mislabeled. One mummy unwrapped in the 19th century turned out to have a wooden stick where a spine should have been ancient DIY at its weirdest. Experts still argue whether embalming mistakes were accidents due to experimentation or deliberate corner-cutting by corrupt embalmers, saving time and money. You're an apprentice embalmer, sweating in the dim light of the workshop. The master shakes his head. Resin supplies are low, linen is scarce, and the family is waiting. He mutters, "Make it look good." You wrap the body as fast as you can, praying no one ever checks your work. So, no, not every mummy was a perfect time capsule. Some were works of art, others were disasters wrapped in bandages. Next time someone says Egyptians perfected mummification, laugh, and as the sarcophagus creaks shut, another myth stirs, this one about power. The idea that only men ruled Egypt, while women stood silently in the background. The image is easy to picture. Egypt's throne room filled with men, pharaohs, generals, priests, while women stand silently in the background, draped in linen, seen but never heard. That's the myth. Egypt was a man's world, and women had no say in power. But the truth, Egyptian women didn't just whisper in the shadows. They ruled, they preached, they negotiated, and sometimes they wore the double crown themselves. The story most people absorb is simple. Pharaohs were always male. Women were there for beauty, for children, or for the background of temple paintings. If a queen's name appears, it's usually attached to her husband. The myth leaves women as silent supporting characters in history's longest play. Reality, Egyptian women had legal rights unheard of in most ancient societies. They could own property, sign contracts, and sue in court. Some rose higher still. Priestesses led major temples, queens ruled as regents, and a handful seized the throne outright. Imagine you're standing in Thebes as Hatshepsut appears before the people. She wears the false beard of kingship, dressed not in queen's linen but in Pharaoh's regalia. Priests chant her name as she proclaims herself ruler, not wife. Centuries later, Cleopatra would command fleets, negotiate with Caesar, and rule Egypt in her own right. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that women could steer Egypt's destiny when power demanded it. Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for over 20 years, expanding trade and overseeing monumental building projects. Some tomb paintings even show women brewing beer, sacred and economic role. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was wages, medicine, and ritual, meaning women literally brewed the currency of Egypt. Egyptologists still argue whether female pharaohs were accepted by the people or tolerated reluctantly. Where Hatshepsut and Cleopatra celebrated leaders, saw controversial rule breakers forced into power. You're a young girl in Thebes, holding your mother's hand as Hatshepsut passes in procession. The crowd kneels, priests raise incense, and your mother whispers, "Look, she rules Egypt." You stare, wide-eyed, realizing the throne isn't only for men. So no, Egypt wasn't just a parade of male rulers while women sewed quietly at home. Women owned businesses, brewed wages, led temples, and in some cases wore the crown. Next time someone says history's queens were powerless, tell them Hatshepsut ruled longer than most kings and Cleopatra spoke 9 languages. How's that for sidelined? And as the queen's incense fades, the Nile glimmers ahead, whispering of fields, harvests, and another myth that Egypt was nothing more than a simple farming society. Close your eyes and picture ancient Egypt. Chances are you see endless rows of farmers hunched over muddy fields, coaxing wheat and barley out of the Nile's gift. That's the classic myth. Egypt as nothing more than a giant farm, a breadbasket where peasants spent their entire lives plowing, planting, and praying for good floods. But the truth, Egypt was far more than simple farming. Its economy was diverse, complex, and surprisingly modern for its time. The story goes like this. Egyptians were farmers, full stop. They tilled the soil, carried water, paid their taxes in grain, and that was it. No industry, no trade, no innovation, just mud, reeds, and baskets of wheat. It's a myth that paints Egypt as static and simple. Reality paints a much richer picture. Yes, farming was central, but Egyptians built an economy that stretched from Nubia to the Mediterranean. They traded gold, papyrus, linen, and crafted luxury goods. They engineered canals, managed irrigation, and ran workshops buzzing with artisans. Egypt wasn't just a farm, it was a machine. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace in Memphis. Merchants shout over one another, hawking jewelry, perfumes, and exotic spices. Scribes jot down contracts on rolls of papyrus. A carpenter planes would import it from Lebanon, while a potter spins clay vessels for export. You smell roasting fish by the docks, hear donkeys braying under heavy loads, and watch foreign traders haggling in strange accents. Farming fed Egypt, but trade, craft, and engineering powered it. Egypt exported papyrus, linen, and grain, while importing cedarwood, copper, ivory, and lapis lazuli, evidence of a complex trade system. Archaeologists uncovered receipts and tax records on pottery shards, showing villagers paying bills, negotiating deals, and even complaining about corrupt officials. Ancient bureaucracy, alive and well. Historians still argue whether Egypt's economy leaned more toward centralized control by the pharaoh or independent local markets driven by merchants. Was it top-down or bottom-up? You're a young apprentice. Scribe at a market stall. A customer slaps down jars of honey as payment for new sandals. You scribble on a potsherd, paid in honey, 2 jars, balance due in figs. Your handwriting ties the transaction into Egypt's buzzing economy. So no, Egypt wasn't just a land of endless mud and tired farmers. It was an economic powerhouse with bustling trade, intricate bureaucracy, and engineering that still stuns us today. Next time someone says Egypt was just a farm, remind them, even their receipts were written on papyrus, the world's first paper trail. And as the market noise fades, another myth approaches the dramatic idea that Egypt vanished. In one sudden collapse, swallowed overnight by history, you stand at the edge of a crumbling temple, sand filling the cracks, pillars leaning like tired giants. In your imagination, you see it happen in a flash. One day Egypt is mighty, the next day gone. The myth says the civilization collapsed, suddenly swallowed by time, as if someone flipped a cosmic switch. But the truth, Egypt's end was no instant tragedy. It was a slow unraveling, centuries of strain that chipped away piece by piece by piece. Here's the version you've probably heard. Egypt fell in a single dramatic collapse, like Atlantis sinking into the sea. Pharaohs vanished, temples emptied, and the sands of time buried everything overnight. It's a clean story, easy to tell, like ripping a page out of a history book. But reality doesn't rip, it frays. Egypt didn't die in one night. It lingered, weakened by droughts, famines, internal rebellions, and waves of foreign invasions. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans all took turns at Egypt's throne. Each left scars, each reshaped the land. Imagine you're a farmer in 1100 BCE. The Nile's floods no longer reach your fields. Grain shrivels, hunger spreads, and whispers of rebellion drift through the village. Centuries later, you're a soldier watching Alexander the Great march triumphantly into Memphis, greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Still later, you're a merchant in Alexandria, hearing Latin echo in the streets as Roman governors take charge. Egypt didn't vanish, it transformed, layer by layer. Climate records show periods of low Nile floods during the late Bronze Age. Collapse, weakening Egypt's food supply and sparking unrest. Cleopatra wasn't just Egypt's last pharaoh. She fought Rome with a fleet at the Battle of Actium. Her defeat marked the official end, but the culture had already been blending with Greece and Rome for centuries. Historians still argue whether Egypt's collapse was mainly due to environmental change, foreign invasion, or internal political decay. Most agree it was a slow process, not a single fall. You're a priest in Thebes, standing before a half-abandoned temple. The incense burns low, offerings fewer than ever. You whisper prayers to gods that fewer and fewer people remember. Outside, a Greek soldier marches past. Your world hasn't ended. So no, Egypt didn't vanish like a candle snuffed out in the night. It flickered, sputtered, and slowly transformed until Rome folded it into its empire. Next time someone says Egypt just collapsed, tell them more like a 3,000-year-long sunset, beautiful, slow, and impossible to miss. And as the last rays of that sunset fade, one final myth rises, the idea that Egypt belongs only to the past, forgotten and irrelevant today. The stars stretch above you, bright as they were thousands of years ago, and you stand before the broken ruins of an ancient temple. The myth whispers, Egypt is over, dead, buried in sand and history books. It was a civilization of pyramids, mummies, and long-gone pharaohs, nothing more than a relic. But the truth, Egypt never really ended. Its influence flows into our lives every day through art, architecture, science, and even the way we dream about eternity. The story goes, Egypt was great once, then it disappeared. Everything it built is buried in tombs, locked in museums, or trapped in tourist postcards. It's a closed chapter, a past that belongs only to archaeologists. That's the myth. Reality is far brighter. Egypt's ideas, symbols, and inventions traveled across centuries. Obelisks stand in Rome, Paris, London, and New York. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. echoes the design of an Egyptian temple. Fashion still borrows eyeliner styles from Cleopatra. Even the calendar in your phone owes something to Egypt's solar measurements. Imagine you're an architect in Paris in the 1800s, gazing at sketches of the Luxor Temple. You design fountains, columns, and even street lamps inspired by its carvings. Or picture yourself in modern Cairo, where ancient hieroglyphs appear on billboards, a proud reminder that history still breathes in the present. The 365-day calendar we use today traces back to Egyptian astronomy, which divided the year based on the Nile's floods and star cycles. Napoleon loved Egypt so much that he carted obelisks back to France. One still stands tall in Paris's Place de la Concorde, a literal piece of Egypt in the heart of Europe. Historians still argue whether Egypt's modern fame is based more on genuine heritage or Egyptomania, the Western obsession that turned sarcophagi into decor and hieroglyphs into tattoo designs. You're a child walking through a museum, staring at a golden mask under glass. You press your nose to the case, eyes wide, realizing this isn't just history, it's a spark that lights your imagination. Egypt's story leaps centuries to meet you, so no, Egypt isn't locked in the past like some dusty exhibit. It's alive in our cities, our culture, and our sense of wonder. Next time someone says Egypt is long gone, tell them, check your calendar, your architecture, or your eyeliner. Egypt never left. The night deepens, the myths have unraveled, and now it's time to let the sands of Egypt settle into a gentle silence. The desert quiets now. The torches burn low, and the last echoes of chisels and chants fade into the night. You walk slowly back toward the Nile, your footsteps soft against the sand. The pyramids rise behind you, not as myths anymore, but as patient witnesses of time. The air is cooler here, almost tender. You can hear the faint ripple of the river, steady and calm, carrying silt, stories, and centuries. Somewhere a breeze lifts a grain of sand, spinning it gently before letting it fall again. That's how Egypt feels, now not heavy with mystery, but light with memory. You picture the pharaohs, not as gods, but as men and women trying their best. You picture the builders, not as slaves, but as proud workers, with bread in their hands and laughter on their lips. You picture Cleopatra, not only painted in gold, but hunched over scrolls, writing letters deep into the night. Every myth you've unwrapped tonight has left behind a truth, and every truth has been softer, more human than the legend. And that's what makes Egypt feel alive, not its curses or gold or eternal monuments, but its people. People who worked, dreamed, stumbled, and hoped just like you. So now, as you lie back in the quiet, let those pyramids shrink in the distance. Let the Nile's rhythm become the rhythm of your breath, slow, gentle, certain. History will wait. Egypt will wait. Tonight is only for rest. Good night, traveler.